The air in Wyoming Territory tasted of red dust and endings. It was the summer of 1886, a season baked dry by a relentless sun that seemed intent on punishing the land for surviving the great blizzard. The snows of that terrible winter were a phantom limb, an ache in the bones of every rancher and townsfolk in Cotton Draw, a memory of cattle frozen upright and hopes buried under drifts higher than a cabin roof. Now, thirst was the new tyrant. The creek beds were mosaics of cracked mud, and the wind did little more than move the heat around, carrying the scent of parched sagebrush and the faint, ever-present smell of wood smoke. Eliza Hart swung the saddle onto her mare's back, the motion fluid, practiced, a conversation between muscle and leather. The horse, a sturdy buckskin named Grits, shifted her weight but did not flinch. Eliza's hands, though slender, were calloused and sure as she cinched the girth, her knuckles tracing the familiar geography of worn straps and cool metal buckles. The world was a place of textures for Eliza, the rough comfort of the horse's coat, the splintery feel of the water trough's edge, the coarse grain of a sack of cornmeal. These were the real things. She tied 2 heavy wooden buckets to the saddle horn, their weight making the leather groan in protest. The first stop of her morning was the Abernathy place, a small homestead a mile out where old Martha Abernathy's well had run dry a week prior. Eliza hauled water for her twice a week, a silent barter for a share of whatever managed to grow in Martha's stubborn little garden. It was a small thread in the web of favors and debts, of work for sustenance. That made up her life. It was how she held on. Tied to the back of her saddle, just beside the bedroll, was a gourd flask. It was old, the surface smoothed by the passing of 1,000 hands, and a dark, spidery crack ran down its side. Her mother had carried it, and now Eliza did. The water inside was for her and her alone, a ration against the day's heat. But the flask itself was heavier than the water it held. It was a reminder of a different kind of thirst, a deeper one. Cotton Draw was not so much a town as an argument with the emptiness around it. A single dusty street connected a squat wooden church, a saloon whose bat-wing doors sighed open and closed like a weary mouth, and a combined post office and general store that smelled of coffee beans, kerosene, and axle grease. Beyond the town, rising like a dark promise against the pale sky, was the silhouette of Black Mesa, the Caldwell Ranch. It was a kingdom of cattle and grassland, a power as real and unavoidable as the summer sun. The Caldwells owned the horizon. Eliza guided Grits down the main street, the buckets sloshing rhythmically. She nodded at a few faces, her expression neutral. The women of the town watched her from behind curtains or from the shade of their porches. They saw the daughter of Silas Hart, the trapper who had lost his nerve and found the bottom of a bottle and the turn of a card with equal passion. They saw a girl who did a man's work, who rode astride instead of side saddle, and their whispers followed her like burrs on a saddle blanket. A woman's place was in the kitchen, they would say, their voices sweetened with piety. A woman's hands were for needlepoint, not for stitching up a gash on a calf's flank. Eliza had heard it all. She had learned to wear their judgment like a second skin, tough and weathered and mostly impenetrable. Her second stop was the church. Reverend Pike stood outside, a man whose kindness was as genuine as his spine was soft. He fretted over a tear in his saddle's fender, his brow furrowed with a gentle, ineffectual worry. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice a soft flutter. "A blessing to see you." "Reverend," Eliza replied, swinging down from her horse. She gave the damaged leather a quick, expert look. "Looks like you tried to ride through a thorn thicket." "The Lord's path is not always clear," he offered with a weak smile. Eliza didn't smile back. "The path to the Widow Jensen's place is thick with mesquite. You ought to know that by now." She pulled a spool of waxed thread and a curved needle from her saddlebag. "I can fix it. It will cost you a sack of cornmeal." Of course. A most generous offer." He scurried inside the church and returned a moment later with the meal. As Eliza worked, her hands deft and efficient, She could feel the town watching. She stitched the heavy leather with tight, even strokes, her focus absolute. This was her currency. Not coins, but competence. She was useful, and in a place like this, useful was a kind of armor. Daniel Caldwell rode past then, a distant figure on a powerful black horse. He was the son, the heir to Black Mesa. He rode with an easy stillness, a man who belonged to the land he was on, his posture speaking of a quiet, unshakable confidence. He didn't look toward the church, his gaze fixed on the far hills, but his presence seemed to lower the temperature by a degree or two. He was part of the landscape, like a hawk circling, and his father, Elias, was the mountain itself, unmoving, hard, and weathered by storms. The blizzard had hit the Caldwell herd hard, and whispers in the general store said Elias had become a man made of iron and cold fury. When the saddle was mended, strong and clean, Eliza accepted the cornmeal without ceremony and secured it to her saddle. As she prepared to mount, a low rumble of laughter drifted from the saloon. 3 men stood in the shade of the porch overhang, their hats low, their spurs glinting. One of them, a man with a narrow face and a way of standing that was all sharp, dangerous angles, was Tate Mallory. He was a Texan who drifted north with his crew, men who made their living on the misfortunes of others. They were debt collectors, vultures who circled men like her father. Mallory's eyes, pale and cold, flicked over to her. He did not smile, but a smirk played on his lips, an expression that felt like a greasy fingerprint on her skin. She met his gaze for a bare second, her own expression unreadable, before swinging onto Gritz's back and turning the horse for home. Sheriff May O'Rourke stepped out of her office then, a shotgun resting in the crook of her arm. She was a woman carved from the same hard granite as the land, her face a map of sun and wind. She said nothing, but she watched Mallory and his men, and her presence was a clear, unspoken warning. The power in Cotton Draw was a 3-way tug-of-war, the brute wealth of the Caldwell Ranch, the predatory opportunism of men like Tate Mallory, and the thin, stubborn line of the law held by Sheriff O'Rourke. Eliza Hart and her small cabin were caught somewhere in the middle, on ground that felt increasingly unstable. The ride home was quiet. The sun beat down, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Her cabin was small, built of sturdy pine logs chinked with mud and time. Her mother had planted a rose bush by the door, a foolish, beautiful act of defiance against the harsh landscape. It was nearly dead now. The leaves withered and brown, but Eliza still watered it every evening from her own cracked gourd, a small ritual of hope. She unsaddled Grits, brushed her down, and filled her trough, pouring the last of the water from the Abernathy buckets. Inside, the cabin was clean and spare. A simple cot, a stone fireplace, a small table, and a single chair. This was her inheritance, not land or money, but a small, defensible space that belonged to her. It was everything. Her father, Silas, was not there. He was rarely there anymore. His traps rusted in the shed, the scent of beaver and muskrat long faded, replaced by the sour smell of whiskey that clung to his clothes when he did stumble home. He was a ghost in his own life, haunted by the man he used to be. Eliza knew where he was. He was in the saloon, chasing a losing hand, digging a hole of debt and shame, and she was the one who would be left to fill it in. She opened the sack from the Reverend, the fine, pale cornmeal a small treasure. She measured out a portion for her supper, her movements economical. As she worked, she thought of the look she'd received in town, of Daniel Caldwell's remote figure, of Tate Mallory's predatory stillness. They were all pieces on a board, and she felt like a solitary pawn, exposed and vulnerable. But she was not broken. She had her horse, her skills, her mother's cabin, and she had the cracked gourd flask, a symbol of her resolve to hold on to what was hers, to ration her own strength, to survive. In the dry heart of Wyoming, survival was a victory won one day. One bucket of water, one mended saddle at a time. The red dust settled on the windowsill. and in the distance, the sun bled across the rugged peaks of Black Mesa, setting the sky on fire. The night fell thick and starless, swallowing the sounds of the prairie inside the Cotton Draw Saloon. The only light came from a pair of smoky kerosene lamps that cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. The air was a foul stew of stale beer, cheap whiskey, and desperation. At a table in the corner, the game had gone on for hours. Silas Hart's hands trembled as he looked at the cards he held. They were worthless. Across the table, Tate Mallory watched him, his pale eyes missing nothing. The small pile of coins in front of Silas had long since vanished. His rifle, his traps, the last of his credit at the general store, all gone. "Looks like you have run out of road." "Hart," Mallory said, his voice a low drawl that cut through the haze. Silas stared at the worn wood of the table, his face ashen. "I have got nothing left." Nothing. Mallory leaned forward, a predator sensing the final, fatal weakness of his prey. "A man always has something." He slid a piece of paper and a pen across the table. "You have got a daughter, a strong one, by the looks of her. Hard worker." He tapped the paper. "Elias Caldwell is always looking for hands, especially after the winter he had. I reckon your daughter's labor is worth something. Sign this. Her work at Black Mesa will clear your slate with me." The other men at the table went silent. The document was a bill of sale, not for a person, but for their time, their sweat, their freedom. A labor contract, legally binding in a territory where a signature was worth more than a man's word. Silas looked at the paper, then at Mallory's unblinking stare. The saloon, which had been his only refuge, now felt like a cage. He picked up the pen, his hand shaking so badly he could barely hold it, and scrawled his name. The ink bled into the paper, a black stain of surrender. The next morning, the story was on the wind, a piece of gossip as gritty and persistent as the dust. It traveled from the saloon to the general store, from the blacksmith's forge to the church steps. By the time Eliza rode into town for supplies, the words had taken on a life of their own, twisted and embellished with each telling. She was tying grits to the hitching post outside the post office when she heard it. Two women, their faces hidden by their bonnets, were talking in low, avid tones. "Can you imagine his own flesh and blood?" one said. "Her father sold her to a rancher owner," the other whispered, the words carrying a morbid thrill. She leaned closer. "And they say old man Caldwell aims to get more than just work out of the deal." The rest was lost in a snicker. Eliza froze, her hand on the hitching rail. The word struck her not like a blow, but like a sudden, chilling drop in temperature. The sun felt no less hot on her skin, the dust no less real in the air, but the world had tilted on its axis. She did not turn. She did not let the tears that pricked the backs of her eyes fall. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and walked into the general store as if she had heard nothing at all, her posture a silent act of defiance. She found her father at the cabin, slumped in the single chair, smelling of stale whiskey and regret. Beside him, standing like a grim statue, was Sheriff May O'Rourke. "Heard the news," the sheriff said, her voice flat. She held up the contract. "A damning sheet of paper. This is legal. Eliza, ugly as a 3-day-old corpse, but legal. Mallory can enforce it." Silas would not look at his daughter. "Liza, he started, his voice a broken rasp. "Do not," she said, her voice quiet but sharp as a shard of glass. "Just do not." She turned to the sheriff. "What does he want?" "Mallory wants his due. He will take Silas for forced labor on the railroad line, or he will take the contract to Elias Caldwell. I have stalled him, told him there were formalities. It bought you 3 days. 3 days to figure out what you were going to do." Sheriff O'Rourke's gaze was hard, but not unkind. "It is a rotten choice." Eliza looked around the small cabin, at the stone hearth her mother had built, at the worn wooden floor she had scrubbed clean 1,000 times. This was the only piece of her mother she had left. Losing it was unthinkable. Working for the Caldwells was a horror, but losing the cabin was an amputation. Her path was clear, a narrow, stony trail through hell. "I will go," she said, her voice steady. "I will work off his debt at Black Mesa, but the cabin stays mine. That is the condition." The sheriff nodded slowly. "I will make sure Mallory understands. He gets his debt paid. He does not get your home." The ride to Black Mesa was long and silent. The ranch house came into view first, a large, imposing structure built of dark timber and river stone, solid and permanent. It was not a home, it was a fortress. Barns, corrals, and bunkhouses spread out from it, a testament to the scale of the Caldwell operation. Elias Caldwell stood on the porch, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face that looked like it had been carved from weathered pine. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, and they held no warmth. Beside him, leaning against a porch post, was his son, Daniel. Daniel's expression was harder to read, his gaze steady and watchful. Eliza dismounted, holding the reins of her horse, the signed contract in her other hand. She did not wait for them to speak. "I am Eliza Hart," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the still air. "My father, Silas Hart, owes a debt to Tate Mallory. This contract signs over my labor to you until it is paid." She held out the paper. Elias did not move. He looked her over, from her scuffed boots to the determined set of her jaw. His eyes were calculating, assessing her worth like he would a horse or a head of cattle. "I have heard," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Mallory was here this morning. A forced labor contract. It is a harsh piece of business, but it is legal in this territory. We need the hands." He finally took the paper, his fingers brushing hers. His touch was cold. "Here," Daniel said quietly from the side, his voice a stark contrast to his father's. "Grass is scarce out here, and people are scarcer. But you are not grass." Eliza's eyes met his for the first time. She saw a flicker of something there, a discomfort with the raw, brutal transaction taking place. He saw a person, not a commodity. "And I am not cattle," she replied, her voice just as quiet, just as firm. A corner of Daniel's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement, a spark of understanding in the cold, hard reality of the moment. Elias Caldwell, however, was unmoved by the exchange. "You will start at dawn," he said, folding the contract and tucking it into his shirt pocket. "The foreman will show you your bunk and your duties. You will work until the debt is paid. That is the arrangement." He turned and went back into the house without another word. The matter settled. Daniel pushed himself off the post. "The bunkhouse for the hired hands is over there," he said, nodding toward a long, low building. "But it is not a place for a woman. There is a small room off the back of the cookhouse. It is private. You can stay there." It was a small concession, a minor act of decency in a profoundly indecent situation, but it was something. "Thank you," Eliza said, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. She turned to lead Grits away, her mind a whirlwind of anger, shame, and a cold, burning resolve. As she walked toward the cookhouse, she reached back and touched the cracked gourd flask tied to her saddle. It was still there, a solid, familiar weight. They had bought her labor, but they did not own her. She would work, she would endure, she would pay the debt, but she would hold on to her own water, her own spirit, and she would survive this. She had to. The sun began to set behind the dark silhouette of the mesa, casting a long shadow that swallowed the ranch and everything in it. Life at Black Mesa was measured by the clang of the cook's triangle at 4 a.m. and the ache in your bones at dusk. The darkness before dawn was cold even in the summer, and it was then that Eliza's work began. She moved through the milking barn, her lantern casting a small, golden circle of light in the vast darkness. The cows shifted in their stalls, their breath misting in the cool air. Her movements were quiet and rhythmic, her hands sure on the animal's udders, the warm milk hissing into the pail. She learned the temperament of each cow, which one was skittish, which one was placid, which one needed a soft word before she would let down her milk. This was the rhythm of the ranch, a relentless forward motion driven by the needs of the herd. After milking came the branding of the new calves, the air filled with the smell of scorched hair and animal fear, the bawling of the calves and the lowing of their mothers. The ranch hands were a rough crew, their hands like leather, their humor as coarse as saddle blankets. Eliza worked alongside them, her smaller frame belying a wiry strength. She learned to swing a rope, to flank a calf and hold it steady for the hot iron. She was quick, her knots clean and tight. One of the hands, a man named Jed with a tobacco-stained beard, watched her work one afternoon. "That is a good hitch you tied there," he grumbled, almost as if the words were being pulled from him against his will. "It holds," Eliza said simply, moving on to the next calf. Later, another hand, younger and full of foolish swagger, tried to make a joke. "Careful you do not break a nail. Little lady." Eliza did not even look at him. She finished cinching a rope and gave it a final, sharp tug. "Talk less," she said, her voice even. "Tie the knot tighter. That calf is about to kick your teeth in." A moment later, the calf did just that, its back leg lashing out and sending the young man stumbling backward into the dust. A few of the men chuckled. After that, the jokes became fewer. Her competence was a language they understood better than words. When her hands blistered and cracked from the rough lariat, she did not complain. She found the cook for a scoop of beef tallow and worked it into her palms by the light of her lantern in her small room, just as she had seen her father do with his trapping gear years ago. From a distance, often on horseback overlooking the corrals, Daniel Caldwell watched her. He had expected a problem. He had expected tears or tantrums or a sullen resentment that would poison the bunkhouse. He had not expected this quiet, ferocious efficiency. He saw more than just a hired hand fulfilling a contract. He saw the way she moved among the cattle, a calming presence in a world of brute force. She was the one who noticed a cow favoring a leg and took the time to check its hoof for stones. She was the one who realized a new mother was rejecting its calf and had the patience to keep bringing the small animal back until the cow finally relented. This was not just labor, it was care. It was the kind of work that did not show up on a ledger but made the difference between a herd that survived and a herd that thrived. It was the work his mother had done, in her own way, a lifetime ago. He found himself respecting Eliza Hart's skills, not pitying her situation. She was not a damsel to be rescued. She was a survivor, and she was, in her own way, more suited to this harsh land than many of the men who worked for his father. The land itself, however, was becoming their greatest enemy. The drought tightened its grip, baking the soil into a cracked gray plate. The water in the main reservoir shrank daily, the edges receding to reveal a cracked, stinking bed of mud. The cattle grew thin, their ribs showing like washboards beneath their hides. One evening, Elias Caldwell stood with his son, staring at the pathetic excuse for a water hole. "We will have to move them," Elias said, his voice hard. "Take them up to the summer pasture in the high country. There is grass there." "They are too weak to make the journey," Daniel argued, his voice low but firm. "We will lose half of them on the trail. They do not have the strength." "We will lose all of them if they stay here and starve," Elias snapped, his frustration a raw, open wound. The memory of the blizzard, of finding his cattle standing like frozen statues in the snow, was a ghost that never left him. He would not be beaten by the land again. "We drive them north at the end of the week." Later that day, Eliza found Daniel by a dry creek bed that snaked its way a few miles from the main reservoir. He was tracing its path with the toe of his boot. "That pasture your father wants to move the herd to?" Eliza said. Not as a question, but as a statement. "The cattle will not make it." Daniel looked at her, his expression grim. "I know." Eliza pointed down the creek bed. "This creek, It is dry on the surface, but my father used to say that in a drought. You follow the willows. There are still willows growing along the banks here. That means there is water underneath. Not much, but maybe enough. She looked toward the reservoir. If we dug a ditch, a shallow one, from here to the reservoir, it might be enough to buy us some time, to give the herd a little more water before they have to move. Daniel looked at the dry creek, then at the distant, shimmering heat rising from the reservoir. He looked at Eliza, at the earnest, practical intelligence in her eyes. It was a long shot, a massive amount of work with no guarantee of success, but it was better than his father's desperate gamble. It was a plan born of observation, not desperation. "All right," he said slowly. "We will try it." The next morning, Daniel pulled a half-dozen men from their usual duties and set them to work with shovels. The ground was hard as iron, and the work was slow and grueling. Elias watched from a distance, his face a mask of disapproval, but he did not intervene. In the south pasture, there was a young filly named Juniper. She was a beautiful horse, all long legs and fiery spirit, but she was wild. She fought every attempt to gentle her eyes wide with a fear that was close to fury. The ranch hands had all but given up on her, labeling her as unbreakable. One evening, after a long day of digging the ditch, Eliza walked to the corral where Juniper was kept. The filly watched her approach, her body tense, ready to bolt. Eliza did not try to get close. She simply leaned against the fence and began to speak, her voice low and soothing. She talked about nothing in particular, about the heat of the day, the color of the sky. She stayed for nearly an hour, and by the time she left, the horse was standing a few feet away, her ears pricked forward, listening. Eliza did this every evening. A few nights later, as she was rubbing beef tallow into her raw hands by the door of her small room, Daniel appeared out of the twilight. He said nothing, but held out a new pair of leather work gloves. They were made of soft, supple deerskin, a luxury in this world of rough cowhide. Eliza looked at the gloves, then up at him, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. She took them, the leather cool and smooth against her skin. A small, wry smile touched her lips. "I thank you," she said. "I was beginning to think only men had hands around here." The hint of a genuine smile touched Daniel's face in return, before he could reply. The sound of an approaching rider made them both turn. Tate Mallory rode into the yard as if he owned it, his horse a showy pinto, his saddle heavy with silver. He dismounted and strode toward the porch, his eyes scanning the ranch, taking in the work on the ditch, the state of the cattle, his gaze finally landing on Eliza. A slow, unpleasant smirk spread across his face. "Caldwell," he called out to Daniel. "Just making my rounds, checking on my investments." His eyes lingered on Eliza, a slimy, possessive look that made her skin crawl. "Seems my collateral is working hard. Make sure you do not wear her out completely. I want to get my full value." Before Eliza could even react, Daniel moved. He did not draw his weapon. He simply stepped in front of her, placing his body between her and Mallory. He was taller than the Texan, and his presence was a solid, unmoving wall. "Mallory," Daniel said, his voice dangerously quiet. "On Black Mesa, we pay our debts with sweat, not with people. You have made your rounds. Now get off our land." Mallory's eyes narrowed, his hand drifting toward the pistol at his hip. He looked at Daniel's calm, steady gaze, at the promise of violence held tightly in check. He looked past Daniel at Eliza's stony face. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Have it your way, Caldwell," he sneered. "For now." He turned, swung back onto his pinto, and rode away, leaving a trail of dust and silent menace hanging in the evening air. Eliza stood frozen for a moment, the new leather gloves clutched in her hand. She looked at Daniel's back, at the way he still stood, a protector, a barrier. The world of contracts and debts and cruel words faded for a moment, and all that was left was the simple, profound fact that he had stood for her. They did not speak. They did not need to. In the distance, from her corral, the wild filly juniper let out a soft, inquisitive nicker into the growing dark. Sunday arrived like a judgment. In the relentless cycle of work at Black Mesa, the seventh day was not for rest, but for resupply. The ranch wagon, loaded with hides and a list of necessities for the general store, made the dusty journey into Cotton Draw. Elias drove, his posture rigid, his eyes on the road. Daniel rode alongside, his quiet presence a familiar part of the landscape. This Sunday, however, was different. A third rider accompanied them. Eliza, mounted on Grits, rode a few paces behind Daniel. Elias had decreed it. She was part of the ranch now, and she would present herself in town as such. It was not a kindness. It was a statement of ownership, a public declaration that the contract was in effect. As they entered the town, the usual low hum of market day seemed to halt for a breath. Faces turned. Conversations faltered. Eliza felt the weight of their gazes, 100 tiny pinpricks on her skin. She was no longer just Silas Hart's daughter, the girl who mended saddles for cornmeal. She was now the property of the Caldwell Ranch, a living, breathing piece of gossip riding down the main street. She kept her eyes forward, her back straight, her hands light on the reins, focusing on the space between Grits's ears. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. The market was a swirl of dust, noise, and smells fresh-baked bread from the baker's wife, the sharp scent of horse manure, the clank of the blacksmith's hammer. While Elias conducted his business, Daniel and Eliza were tasked with securing provisions from the store. As they walked, the whispers followed, curling around them like smoke. There she is, with the son, bought and paid for, I hear. A shame what a man's gambling can lead to. Daniel walked beside her, his long-limbed stride easy and unhurried. He did not acknowledge the whispers, but she could feel a tension in him, a tightening in the set of his shoulders. He was not ignoring the talk. He was absorbing it, shielding her from it with the sheer force of his presence. It was a new kind of protection, not with words or weapons, but with proximity. By simply standing next to her, he was declaring her a person, not a rumor. The church service was the true ordeal. The small wooden building was stuffy with the heat of the day and the scent of dry, brittle hymnals. Reverend Pike stood at the pulpit, his face earnest and perspiring, speaking of parables and distant lands that had no connection to the parched reality of Wyoming. The congregation, however, was focused on a much nearer drama. Eliza sat in the Caldwell pew, a space she had never occupied before, next to Daniel. The whispers were quieter here, but more venomous. A rustle of fabric, a shared glance over the top of a fan, a sibilant hiss of judgment passing from one woman to another. The words her father sold her were a contagion, spreading through the pews. Reverend Pike, sensing the unrest but too timid to confront it, raised his voice, his sermon becoming a flustered, disjointed plea for Christian charity. It was Mrs. Gable, the saloon owner's wife, a woman whose piety was as sharp and thin as her nose, who finally gave the malice a voice. In a pause between the sermon and the final hymn, she leaned toward her neighbor and said, in a stage whisper that carried through the entire church, "It is a disgrace to have such a woman in the Lord's house, a souled girl, bringing her shame among decent folk." A collective intake of breath, a delicious, horrified silence, fell over the church. All eyes turned to Eliza. This was it, the moment she had been dreading, the public branding. She felt a tremor go through her, a wave of cold fury and hot shame. She could feel Daniel shift beside her, ready to rise, to speak. But before he could, she put a hand on his arm, a feather-light touch that was also a command to wait. This was her battle to fight. Slowly, deliberately, Eliza stood up. She was not a tall woman, but in that moment, she seemed to fill the small church. She turned, not to Mrs. Gable, but to face the entire congregation. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was as clear and steady as a deep, cool well. My father's debt was sold, she said, her eyes sweeping over their faces, meeting their stares without blinking. Not my dignity. The silence that followed was different. It was stunned, heavy, uncertain. She had not cried. She had not shouted. She had simply taken their ugly word, sold, and handed it back to them. Redefined. She had drawn a line in the dust, separating her father's actions from her own worth. She sat back down, her heart hammering against her ribs. The spell was broken. Reverend Pike, looking utterly lost, stammered his way through an announcement for the closing hymn. Beside her, Daniel leaned close, his mouth near her ear. "They are probably just afraid," he whispered, his voice a low, private rumble, "that you will teach the cattle to read." A bubble of surprised laughter escaped her, a genuine, unbidden sound. In the midst of the suffocating tension, he had given her air. It was a ridiculous, wonderful thing to say. She looked at him, and for the first time, she truly saw him. Not as a Caldwell, not as the rancher's son, but as a man who met cruelty with a quiet, absurd humor. "I would have to teach the men first," she whispered back, and the ghost of a smile she saw on his face was its own small victory. Outside, in the harsh light of midday, the confrontation continued. As they walked toward the wagon, Mrs. Gable, emboldened by the support of her friends, stood with her arms crossed. "Well, I never," she said loudly to no one in particular. The nerve of some people. Before Daniel or Elias could react, Sheriff May O'Rourke materialized at their side. She had been watching from her office across the street. She tipped her hat slightly. "Afternoon. Caldwell's. Miss Hart," her eyes, sharp and intelligent, moved to Mrs. Gable. "Everything all right here?" "Beatrice. You seem a little overwrought. Would not want to have to enforce the public disturbance ordinance on the Lord's Day." It was not a question. It was a command. "Mrs." Gable's face paled. She sputtered for a moment, then clamped her mouth shut, turned, and disappeared back into the crowd. The sheriff gave a slight, satisfied nod and moved on, her presence having restored a fragile peace. At the general store, while the last of the supplies were being loaded, a new topic was buzzing among the men gathered around the Cracker Barrel. A survey team for the Union Pacific Railroad had been seen 20 miles to the south. They were looking for a route for a new spur line. "If that line comes through here," one man said, his voice full of excitement, "land prices will triple overnight. Even a worthless patch of scrub will be worth a fortune." Tate Mallory, who had been leaning against the counter, pushed himself upright. He did not join the conversation, but his eyes had a new, predatory gleam. He looked out the window, his gaze settling for a moment on the dusty road that led out of town, the road that passed by a certain small, isolated cabin. The true nature of his game was beginning to reveal itself. It was not about a gambler's debt, it was about the land. The ride back to Black Mesa was quiet. The sun was hot, the dust thick, the sound of the church bell, ringing to signal the end of the day's services, followed them for a time. A thin, hollow sound that seemed to offer no comfort, no real sanctuary. As the sound faded, Daniel rode up beside his father. "Why did you agree to it?" Daniel asked, his voice low. "Mallory's contract. You did not have to." Elias kept his eyes on the horizon. His face was unreadable, a mask of hard-won experience. For a long moment, it seemed he would not answer. "During the big blizzard," he said finally, his voice rough, "I was out looking for strays. Found Silas Hart in a snowdrift not 5 miles from his cabin. He was chasing a ghost of a rumor about a trapped elk, drunk and half-frozen. His horse was already dead. I threw him on the back of mine and dragged him home. He would have been dead in another hour." Daniel stared at his father, stunned. "He has owed me his life for months," Elias continued, his tone devoid of sentiment, long before he owed Mallory his money. "When Mallory came to me with that contract, I had a choice. Let your father be hauled off to a railroad camp where he would likely die, or let his daughter work off the debt here. Where I can see it paid, I chose the one that seemed less of a waste. He spat into the dust. It was a business decision. Nothing more. But Daniel knew it was more. It was a complicated, messy act of frontier morality. A debt of life tangled up with a debt of coin. His father was not a cruel man. Not entirely. He was a man who had seen too much loss, and who now measured the world in terms of survival and waste. Eliza, riding behind them, heard none of it. She was lost in her own thoughts, the events of the day replaying in her mind, the hate in the church, the strength she had found within herself, the startling, disarming humor of the man riding in front of her. She looked at the vast, empty landscape stretching out before them, at the dark silhouette of the mesa rising to meet the sky. The church bell was long gone. Its empty promises faded into the silence of the prairie. Here, there were no easy answers, no simple hymns. There was only the hard ground, the hot sun, and the quiet, unspoken promise of a man who stood beside you, not in front of you, as you faced the world. The work on the ditch was a brutal, sweaty affair, a war waged with shovels and pickaxes against the unyielding earth. But after days of relentless labor, they broke through. A dark, damp patch appeared in the dry creek bed, then a seep, then a slow, muddy trickle. It was not a river, not even a stream. It was a thin, silver thread of hope, a fragile pulse of life returning to the land. As it crept along the newly dug channel toward the reservoir, a quiet cheer went up from the exhausted men. Daniel watched the water's slow progress, a look of profound relief on his face. He caught Eliza's eye across the dusty expanse and gave a short, sharp nod. It was a shared victory, a testament to an idea born of observation and a trust that had been earned with blisters and sweat. But the land was a fickle partner, prone to violent mood swings. The relief was short-lived. The next afternoon, the sky began to change. The brilliant, punishing blue faded to a sickly yellow. The wind, which had been a constant, hot breath for weeks, died completely. An unnatural stillness fell over the ranch, heavy and oppressive. The cattle sensed it first. They stopped grazing, their heads coming up, their nostrils flaring. They began to mill restlessly, their lowing taking on a nervous, questioning tone. Eliza, who was helping a young cowhand named Billy mend a section of fence near the north pasture, felt the change in the air. It was a pressure in her ears, a grit on her teeth. She looked to the west, and what she saw made her blood run cold. A colossal wall of red dust was rising from the horizon, a churning, monstrous cloud that blotted out the sun and seemed to consume the sky. "Dust storm!" she yelled, her voice nearly lost in the sudden, eerie silence. "Billy, get to the bunkhouse now." But it was too late. The storm hit them with the force of a physical blow. The world vanished in a blinding, suffocating whirlwind of red dirt. The roar was deafening. A freight train of wind and sand that scoured the land. The cattle, already on edge, broke. A single panicked bawl turned into a tsunami of fear, and the herd stampeded. A blind, thundering mass of hooves and horns moving as one. They were running straight for the section of fence Billy had been working on. The boy, no more than 15, was caught in the open, frozen with terror directly in their path. Instinct took over. Eliza was already on grits, the horse's reins in her hand. She vaulted into the saddle, her face wrapped in her bandana. She could barely see, the air a thick, choking soup. But she could hear the thunder of the hooves, and she knew where the boy was. She spurred Grits forward, not away from the stampede, but alongside it, riding into the heart of the storm. From the main yard, Daniel had seen the wall of dust hit. He was already on his horse, shouting orders, his voice raw against the wind. The north gate, get the north gate open. He saw the herd break, and then, through a momentary swirl in the dust, he saw the small, terrifying shape of the boy, and the lone rider, Eliza, charging toward the chaos. Eliza knew she could not stop them. She had to turn them. She pulled a small, high-pitched whistle from her pocket, a trick her father had taught her for signaling across long distances. She blew it, a piercing shriek that cut through the roar of the wind. The lead steers, their eyes rolling white with panic, heard the unfamiliar sound. They faltered, their momentum shifting slightly. She spurred Grits closer, a phantom in the red gloom, a ghost rider on a pale horse, and blew the whistle again, turning her mount to angle the leaders away from the fence, away from the boy. At the same moment, Daniel and two other hands reached the secondary gate. They threw it open, creating an escape route, a path of least resistance for the panicked animals. Daniel saw Eliza working the edge of the herd, a small, determined figure guiding a force of nature. It was a piece of horsemanship so skilled, so impossibly brave, that it took his breath away. The lead cattle veered toward the open gate, and the rest of the herd followed, a river of terrified beef pouring through the opening and out into the relative safety of the larger pasture. The storm passed as quickly as it had come. The wind died down, leaving a thick red haze that settled on everything like a bloody shroud. The cattle were scattered but safe. Billy, the young cowhand, was covered in dust, his face pale with shock, but he was unharmed, huddled against a fence post. Eliza dismounted, her body trembling with adrenaline. She was caked in grime, her hair and clothes the color of the red earth. She walked over to Grits, stroking the horse's neck, her own breath coming in ragged gasps. She unhooked the cracked gourd flask from her saddle. Her hands were shaking as she uncorked it and poured a small amount of the precious water onto her bandana, wiping the thickest of the grime from her face and eyes. Daniel walked up to her, leading his horse. The yard was quiet now, except for the nervous lowing of the cattle and the stunned silence of the men. He stopped a few feet from her, his face a mask of dust and awe. He watched her perform the small, private ritual of cleaning her face, and in that moment, he saw not a contract worker, but the woman who had just saved a boy's life and a good portion of his herd through sheer nerve and skill. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a clean, folded handkerchief. He held it out to her, his gesture hesitant, almost shy. "Here," he said, his voice rough with dust. Eliza looked at the clean square of white cotton, a startling contrast to the red world around them. She looked up at his face, at the sincerity in his dust-caked eyes. Their gazes held for a long moment, a silent conversation passing between them that had nothing to do with contracts or debts, and everything to do with the shared, terrifying experience they had just survived. She took the handkerchief, their fingers brushing for a fleeting second. The touch was a small spark in the heavy air. "I owe you a handkerchief," she said, her voice barely a whisper. A slow smile spread across Daniel's face, cracking the layer of dust on his cheeks. "Just pay me back," he said, his voice regaining some of its usual wry humor. "By not teaching the cattle to unionize and steal my job." The tension broke. Eliza let out a soft laugh, and the sound seemed to help clear the air. That evening, the mood in the bunkhouse was somber. The men were exhausted, their nerves frayed. The near disaster had left the herd skittish, and the prospect of a long, watchful night was daunting. Eliza found Daniel by the main corral, checking the latches on the gates. "They will be restless tonight," she said. "They will need a constant watch. The men are worn out. They will fall asleep on their feet." Daniel nodded, his expression weary. "I know. We should split the night into 4 watches," Eliza proposed, her tone practical. 2 men on each. That way, no one is out for more than a few hours. They will get some real sleep. They will be better for it tomorrow. Daniel stopped what he was doing and looked at her. It was a sensible, efficient plan, the kind of thinking that kept a ranch running. He had been about to order a simple half-and-half watch, a brutal, exhausting shift for all involved. He considered her words, then looked over at the tired faces of his men. "You are right," he said. He pulled a piece of chalk from his pocket and began to sketch out a roster on the side of the water trough. When he was done, he handed the chalk to her. "You take the third watch. From midnight to 3, pick one man to go with you. You are in charge of that shift." It was more than an agreement. It was an act of trust. He was giving her authority, placing the safety of his herd in her hands. She took the chalk without a word and wrote the name Jed next to hers, the old, grizzled hand who had acknowledged her skill with a rope. He would not give her any trouble. The first 2 watches passed quietly. The moon rose, casting a pale, ghostly light over the dust-coated ranch. When it was her turn, Eliza moved through the sleeping yard, her steps silent. She found Jed already waiting, a rifle cradled in his arms. They took up their positions, circling the large holding corral, their presence a quiet reassurance to the nervous cattle. It was in the deepest part of the night, in that still silent hour before the false dawn, that she saw it. A flicker of light near the far side of the massive hay barn. It was not a lantern. It was too low to the ground, too furtive. She froze, her eyes straining in the darkness. She saw a figure, low and crouched, moving away from the barn and disappearing into the shadows. Then she smelled it. Kerosene. Her heart leaped into her throat. The hay barn was the lifeblood of the ranch, especially after the drought. It held the winter feed, the difference between survival and ruin. To lose it would be a mortal blow. She did not scream. There was no time. She saw the source of the flicker, a small, steady flame, a fuse, crawling along a dark, wet line on the ground, a trail of kerosene leading directly to the barn's massive wooden doors. "Jed the barn," she hissed. Without a second thought, she ran to the nearest water trough, grabbed a heavy wooden shovel that was leaning against it, and plunged it deep into the murky water. She raced toward the burning fuse, the wet shovel heavy in her hands. With a desperate, powerful swing, she brought the flat of the shovel down on the flame, smothering it, beating the fire out of the oil-soaked ground. She struck it again and again, the wet wood sizzling and smoking, until the last spark was gone, leaving only the reek of kerosene and the black, greasy scar on the earth. By then, the yard was alive with light and noise. Jed had fired his rifle into the air, and men were pouring out of the bunkhouse, Daniel in the lead, a pistol in his hand. He saw the dark stain on the ground, the shovel in Eliza's hands, and understood instantly what had happened. "Who did you see?" he demanded, his voice a low, furious growl. "A man, running toward the south fence," Eliza said, her voice shaking slightly. Daniel and 2 of his men took off in that direction. They found him just as he was about to slip through the fence. Tate Mallory. They dragged him back into the center of the yard, into the circle of lantern light. Mallory's face was smug, defiant. "Looks like you had a little accident," he sneered. Pity, a murderous rage, cold and pure, rose in Daniel. He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer cocking echoing in the tense silence. He could end it, right here, right now. He could rid the world of this parasite. He saw the flicker of fear in Mallory's eyes, and it fueled his anger. But then he looked past Mallory and saw Eliza, standing by the barn, her face pale in the lantern light. He saw the strength in her, the way she had faced the fire, not with panic, but with action. He thought of her words in the church, her quiet dignity. Violence was Mallory's language, not his. Slowly, deliberately, Daniel lowered the pistol. He holstered it. He then stepped forward and, with a speed that Mallory did not anticipate, grabbed the front of his shirt and threw him bodily to the ground. "Get off my land," Daniel snarled, his voice trembling with contained fury. "If I ever see your face here again, I will not be so patient." A horse was approaching at a gallop. Sheriff May O'Rourke rode into the yard, a shotgun resting across her saddle. She had seen the commotion from town. She took in the scene at a glance, the kerosene can lying near the barn, the blackened earth, Mallory on the ground, Daniel standing over him, his chest heaving. "Seems I arrived at a busy time," she said, her voice dry. She dismounted. "Attempted arson is a serious charge. Mallory, She took out a small notebook. "I will be taking statements from everyone." Mallory scrambled to his feet, brushing the dust from his clothes. His face was a mask of cold hatred. He looked at Daniel, at Eliza, and then at the sheriff. "You have got nothing on me," he spat. "This is not over. Caldwell. You want to play with contracts and rules? Fine. I will be back, and I will have the full force of the law in my hand when I tear this place down around you." He turned and stalked out of the ranch yard, a promise of a different kind of war hanging in the air behind him. True to his word, Tate Mallory did not return with a gun. He returned with the law, or a twisted version of it, weaponized and aimed at the one piece of ground Eliza held sacred. Sheriff O'Rourke brought the notice herself, her face grim as she rode into the Black Mesa yard a week after the attempted arson. The air still held a faint, acrid memory of kerosene, and a dark, ugly scorch mark stained the wall of the hay barn, a constant reminder of how close they had come to ruin. The document was a formal legal filing with the county circuit court. It was full of convoluted phrases and articles, but its intent was as simple and brutal as a knife to the throat. Tate Mallory, citing a vaguely worded clause in the original debt agreement Silas Hart had signed, was laying claim to the deed and title of Eliza's cabin. The clause mentioned sufficient collateral to cover the full value of the debt should labor prove inadequate. And Mallory's lawyer was now arguing that the only collateral Silas possessed of any value was that small plot of land. "He cannot do that," Daniel said, his voice a low, dangerous growl as he read the paper over the sheriff's shoulder. Silas never owned the land. It was hers, from her mother. He had no right to offer it. "That is what a judge is for," the sheriff said, her tone weary, "to sort out rights. The problem is this." She pointed a gloved finger to the bottom of the document. 2 signatures were affixed as witnesses to the supposed terms of the agreement. The first was one of Mallory's men. The second, in a familiar, shaky script, was that of Reverend Pike. Eliza stared at the name. It felt like a different kind of betrayal, smaller and sadder than Mallory's open villainy. It was the betrayal of a weak man, a man who would stand for what was right only until it became inconvenient or frightening. She imagined Mallory cornering the Reverend, his voice low and threatening, and the good man folding like a cheap suit. When Elias Caldwell read the notice, a dark flush spread across his neck. He crushed the paper in his fist. "This is not about law." He spat, his eyes like chips of ice. "This is an attack. He tried to burn us out, and failed. Now he uses paper. The response to a snake in the yard is not to file a complaint. It is to take a shovel and cut its head off." He looked at Daniel, his meaning clear. "We handle this ourselves. Tonight." "No," Daniel said, his voice quiet but unyielding. He stood between his father and the rest of the yard, a deliberate act of opposition. That is what he wants. He wants to drag us down into the mud with him. He knows that world better than we do. A shooting on the street is just another dead body for the sheriff to deal with. But this, he took the crumpled paper from his father's hand and smoothed it out. "This is a different fight." "This is cowardice," Elias roared, his face contorted with fury. "This is strategy," Daniel countered, his voice never rising, yet it held a core of steel that his father's rage could not bend. "He has chosen the field of battle. Father, we have to be smart enough to beat him on it. We live by water and law out here, not by blood. If we forget that, we are no better than he is." The 2 men stood locked in a silent war of wills, the Old West clashing with the New. Finally, Elias turned away, a guttural sound of disgust in his throat. He did not agree, but he did not forbid it. For now, Daniel would have his way. Daniel knew he needed help. The law was a tangle of briars he did not know how to navigate. His mind went to the railroad men, the surveyors with their strange instruments and their talk of contracts in eastern courts. The next morning, he rode south, toward their camp. He found it in a shallow valley, a small, orderly canvas town that stood in stark contrast to the wild landscape. A lawyer, A man named Samuel Abernathy had arrived a few days prior to handle land use agreements. He was a man in a crisp suit, his face pale from indoor work, and he was not impressed by a local rancher's squabble. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, his tone dismissive as he looked over the document. "This is a petty local dispute. I am here on behalf of the Union Pacific Railroad, not to settle gambling debts. That man, Tate Mallory, is trying to use this debt to steal land," Daniel said patiently. "Land that the Union Pacific might soon be very interested in, if the spur line comes through Cotton Draw. Mallory is a land speculator in vulture's clothing. Helping me now might be good for your business later." Abernathy's eyes sharpened. That was a language he understood. He took the paper and began to read it again, this time with a lawyer's predatory focus. He grunted, his finger tracing a line of spidery script. "This is interesting," he murmured. "The original debt, it specifies an interest rate, compounded weekly, in case of default." He looked up at Daniel. "This rate he has charged is usurious. It is well above the legal limit for the territory. A judge would look very unkindly on that. In fact, it could be argued that the illegal nature of the interest terms invalidates any and all punitive clauses attached to the debt." It was a sliver of hope, a small crack in Mallory's legal fortress. Daniel rode back to Black Mesa, feeling a cautious optimism he had not felt in days. He explained the situation to Eliza that evening, in the quiet moments after the evening meal. They stood by the corral, the scent of horse and hay a comforting familiarity in a world that had become dangerously uncertain. "Mr. Abernathy thinks we have a chance," Daniel finished. "The hearing is in 3 days at the county seat. He will speak for us. He will handle it." Eliza was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on the wild filly, Juniper, who now watched her with a curious, almost gentle expression. When Eliza finally spoke, her voice was firm. "He can speak about the law," she said, "but I will speak for the cabin." Daniel started to protest. "You do not have to. That is what a lawyer is for. You should not have to face them all again." She turned to face him, and in the fading light, he saw the unshakable resolve in her eyes. "It was my mother's home. Daniel, it is my name they are dragging through the mud. It is my future he is trying to steal. If I let other people fight all my battles for me, what will be left of me when it is all over? I will not hide behind you, or your father, or some railroad lawyer. I will stand up, and I will speak for myself." Daniel looked at her, at the fierce pride etched on her face, and he understood. He had been trying to protect her, to shield her, but he saw now that true respect was not about shielding someone, but about trusting them to stand on their own. He was learning to step back, to make room for her strength. "All right," he said softly. "We will do it your way." The journey to the county seat felt like a ride to a hanging. The town was larger than Cotton Draw. The courthouse, a 2-story brick building that loomed over the street with an air of cold, impartial authority. Daniel, Eliza, and Mr. Abernathy walked up the steps, the sound of their boots echoing in the tense silence. Just before they reached the heavy oak doors, Daniel stopped. He pulled a small, carved wooden comb from his pocket and began to run it through his hair, his movements awkward and stiff. He was a man who could break a wild horse or face down a stampede without a flicker of fear, but the prospect of this formal, indoor battle had him completely unnerved. He missed a spot above his ear, leaving a tuft of hair sticking straight up. Eliza watched him, and a genuine, warm smile touched her lips, chasing away some of the tension in her own heart. "Daniel," she said gently. He stopped, looking at her, his expression a mixture of anxiety and embarrassment. "You ride a horse much better than you comb your hair," she said, her voice soft and full of a quiet humor. She reached up, and with a natural, unthinking gesture, she smoothed down the errant lock of hair. Her fingers brushed against his temple for a brief moment, a touch that was both fleeting and profound. The courtroom was packed. It seemed the entire population of Cotton Draw had made the journey to witness the spectacle. Tate Mallory sat at the plaintiff's table, a smug, confident look on his face. Beside him, looking pale and miserable, was Reverend Pike. When the circuit judge called her name, Eliza walked to the witness stand. She did not look at Mallory. She did not look at the pitying or curious faces in the crowd. She looked directly at the judge, a stern, gray-haired man whose eyes had seen every kind of human folly. She told her story. She spoke of her mother, of building the cabin with her own hands, of the rose bush that still struggled to grow by the door. She spoke of her father's weakness and of the debt, which she had never denied. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She simply laid out the truth, her words plain and honest. The contract was for my labor, she concluded, her voice ringing with a quiet clarity. A home is not collateral. It is a life, and Mr. Mallory is trying to steal mine. Then Mr. Abernathy rose and, in a calm, precise voice, dismantled Mallory's case on the fine point of the law, exposing the illegal interest rate as the rotten foundation upon which the entire claim was built. The judge listened, his expression unchanging. When they were finished, he looked at Tate Mallory, his gaze cold. "This court does not reward thieves who use legal documents as their jimmy," he said, his voice like the crack of a gavel. He ruled that the punitive clause regarding collateral was null and void. The original debt for labor stood, but the claim on the cabin was dismissed. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Eliza felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her knees. Daniel, standing beside her, let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. Tate Mallory's face was a mask of incandescent rage. He had been beaten, publicly and legally. He stormed out of the courtroom, his furious exit a promise that this was far from over. On the long ride home, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. The legal victory felt real, a solid weight in Eliza's chest. But as they approached Black Mesa, she could see the dark, ugly scar on the wall of the hay barn, still visible in the twilight. The court's seal, a symbol of formal, civilized justice, had saved her home. But the scorch mark was a different kind of symbol, a reminder of the lawless, violent world that still lay just beneath the surface, waiting for its moment. The fight was not over. It had only changed its form. The court's verdict did not bring peace. It brought a tense, watchful quiet, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm breaks. For 2 weeks, Black Mesa existed in a state of siege. The men worked with rifles slung over their shoulders, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Tate Mallory was gone from Cotton Draw, but his presence lingered like a poison in the air. He had been beaten by the law, and a man like him would not let that stand. His revenge, when it came, would be outside the law. Then, after a long, cruel summer of dust and drought, the sky broke. The rain began in the dead of night, not a gentle shower, but a violent, torrential downpour that hammered against the roofs and turned the dry, cracked earth into a sea of running mud. It was a cleansing rain, a blessing that should have brought relief. But tonight, it felt like a shroud. Eliza could not sleep. The relentless drumming of the rain on the cookhouse roof was a restless sound, and it stirred a matching restlessness in her soul. She sat on the edge of her cot, fully dressed, listening to the sounds of the storm, and through the constant roar of the water, she heard something else. It was a sound that did not belong, a dull, rhythmic clinking of metal against stone, quickly muffled, followed by a low, guttural curse that was swallowed by the wind. It was the sound of a hobbled horse where no horse should be. She did not hesitate. She pulled on her slicker, grabbed a lantern, and slipped out into the deluge. The wind tore at her, and the rain was a cold, blinding sheet, shielding the lantern. She moved toward the far pasture, the one that bordered the rough, broken country of the basalt hills. It was where they were keeping the breeding herd, the core of Black Mesa's future. The prize heifers and the 2 prize bulls they had spent a fortune to acquire. As she drew closer, she saw them dark shapes in the night, men on horseback, moving with a quiet, predatory purpose. They were not driving the herd hard, but methodically cutting the best of the animals from the rest, pushing them toward a narrow pass in the hills, and she saw the flickering light of torches, a sure sign of rustlers who had no fear of being seen. She turned and ran, her boots sinking into the mud, her lungs burning. She burst into the main ranch house without knocking. "Rustlers," she gasped, rain and mud dripping from her onto the floor. "They are in the north pasture. They are taking the breeding herd." The house exploded into action. Daniel was already pulling on his boots, a pistol holstered at his hip. Elias emerged from his room, his face a thundercloud, a heavy Winchester rifle in his hand. The alarm was sounded, and in moments, the yard was a chaos of men and horses, the beams of their lanterns cutting through the driving rain. They rode out into the storm, a small, grim posse plunging into the teeth of the gale. Eliza rode with them, Grits sure-footed even on the slick, treacherous ground. The chase was a nightmare of blurred shapes and blinding rain, guided only by the distant, flickering torches and the panicked bawling of the stolen cattle. They caught up to them on the rocky slopes of the basalt hills. Tate Mallory and a half-dozen hired guns were forcing the terrified animals up a steep, narrow trail. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene in a brilliant, terrifying flash. The rolling eyes of the cattle, the hard, cruel faces of the men, the glint of wet steel on their gun barrels. The air erupted with gunfire. It was a close, brutal fight on the slippery, rain-slicked rock. A horse screamed and went down. A man cursed as his rifle slipped from his grasp. In the chaos, Elias pushed his mount forward, trying to turn the herd back. Mallory saw him and spurred his own horse to intercept. Elias's horse lost its footing on a patch of wet basalt, stumbling to its knees. In that moment of vulnerability, Mallory was on him, the muzzle of his pistol pressed against Elias's chest. "It ends now, old man," Mallory snarled, his face a mask of triumphant hate. Before he could pull the trigger, Daniel's horse slammed into Mallory's, driving him back. Daniel threw himself from the saddle, landing between his father and the gun. "You will have to go through me," he roared over the storm. Mallory's attention was fixed on Daniel. To his right, one of his men saw the opening and raised his rifle, taking aim at Daniel's exposed back. From the edge of the fray, Eliza saw the movement. There was no time to shout a warning. She acted on pure instinct, her lariat, already in her hand, swung once, a heavy, water-soaked loop that flew through the rain with uncanny accuracy. It snapped tight around the rifleman's arm, the force of it yanking him half out of his saddle and sending his rifle cartwheeling into the darkness. The man, thrown off balance, stumbled against Elias, who was just regaining his feet. A stray shot from another rustler went wide, but a sliver of rock kicked up by the bullet sliced across Elias's arm, drawing a thin line of blood. He staggered back, his own rifle now free. He had a clear shot at Tate Mallory. Mallory froze, his eyes wide, a cornered rat expecting the killing blow. The rage on Elias's face was terrible to behold. He raised the Winchester, the barrel steady despite the rain and his wound. This was the moment he had craved, the simple, violent justice he understood. But as he looked at Mallory, at the pathetic, craven fear in the man's eyes, something shifted. This was not a fight for survival. This was an execution. Slowly, deliberately, Elias lowered the rifle. "This land," he said, his voice a low growl that was somehow more menacing than a shout, "nurtures people who keep their word. You are not that kind." Just as the standoff hung in a tense, uncertain balance, Tate Mallory made one last, desperate, cowardly move. He saw Eliza, a spectral figure on her horse, the source of all his failures. He swung his pistol toward her, a final, spiteful act of revenge. "Liza!" a voice screamed from the darkness. A figure lunged out of the night, a man on foot, stumbling and slipping on the rocks but moving with a desperate purpose. He crashed into Eliza, shoving her from Gritz's saddle just as Mallory's gun fired. Silas' heart cried out, a sharp, choked sound, as the bullet struck him high in the chest. He collapsed in the mud at his daughter's feet. Eliza scrambled to his side, her mind reeling. He was sober, his eyes clear for the first time in years, and filled with a terrible, wrenching pain. He reached for her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "I am not selling you anymore." "Liza," he gasped, a bloody froth on his lips. "I am buying you back, with my life." The cowardly act broke the will of Mallory's men. Seeing their leader shoot an unarmed man in the back, they faltered. Daniel seized the moment. He stood over Eliza and her father, a towering figure of righteous fury, and roared at the remaining rustlers, his voice cutting through the storm. Her father sold her to a rancher owner, he bellowed, throwing their own poison back at them. "But tonight, the people of this ranch are her protectors, I am." It was no longer a piece of gossip. It was a vow, a declaration of war, a claim of loyalty that was sealed in blood and rain. The rustlers threw down their guns. The fight was over. As if on cue, a line of lanterns appeared at the bottom of the hill. Sheriff May O'Rourke and a posse of townsmen, alerted by the sounds of the battle, had arrived. They took the sullen, defeated men into custody, clapping Tate Mallory in irons. The rain began to fall even harder, a final, cleansing deluge. It washed the blood from the rocks and extinguished the last of the rustlers' sputtering torches. Eliza, kneeling in the mud and cradling her father's head, felt something press against her hip. She reached down, and her fingers found the shattered pieces of her mother's gourd flask, broken in the fall. The last of its water, the water she had hoarded and protected for so long, was gone. Mingled with the mud and the relentless, purifying rain, she was no longer holding on to it alone. The world outside was a churning chaos of wind and water, but the kitchen of the Black Mesa ranch house became a pocket of quiet, focused intensity. They carried Silas in, a dead weight in their arms, and laid him gently on the long wooden table. He was alive, his breathing shallow and ragged, a dark stain spreading across the front of his soaked shirt. Eliza moved with a purpose that pushed back the shock and grief. This was a world she understood, the world of a body in need, of a wound that required tending. "Daniel, get the fire going. We need light and warmth," she commanded, her voice low and steady. "Elias, I need clean water, boiled, and every strip of clean cloth you can find." Daniel did not hesitate. He knelt at the massive stone hearth, his movements swift and sure as he arranged kindling and struck a match. A small, hungry flame flickered to life, a fragile promise against the cold and dark. Elias, his face a grim, unreadable mask, moved to the stove, his injured arm held stiffly at his side, and began to pump water into a kettle. Eliza took a knife from the kitchen block and began to cut away the wet, bloody fabric of her father's shirt. The bullet had entered high on his chest, a nasty, ragged wound that was bleeding sluggishly. It had missed the heart, a miracle of inches. He was unconscious now, his face pale and waxy in the growing firelight. She worked with a calm precision, cleaning the wound as best she could with the hot water Elias brought, her hands gentle but firm. She packed the wound and bound it tightly with strips of a torn linen sheet, her movements economical and practiced. The bleeding slowed, then stopped. He was stable. For now. For a long time, the only sounds in the room were the crackle of the growing fire, the hiss of the rain against the window panes, and the soft sounds of Eliza's work. When she was finished, she slumped into a chair, the adrenaline draining away, leaving a profound, bone-deep weariness in its place. Daniel had built the fire into a steady, roaring blaze that filled the kitchen with a warm, golden light and pushed back the shadows. He stood now, leaning against the mantel, watching Eliza. Elias sat at the far end of the table, his rifle resting against the wall, his gaze fixed on his son. He was seeing him, truly seeing him, perhaps for the first time, not as a boy to be molded, but as a man who had met chaos and violence with a clear head and a steady hand. He had chosen law over the gun, and in doing so, had shown a different, quieter kind of strength. "I was wrong," Elias said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. The admission seemed to cost him something, to be pulled from a place deep inside him. Out there, on the rocks. I wanted to kill him. I would have. Daniel turned from the fire to look at his father. "I know. All these years," Elias continued, his gaze dropping to his own calloused hands, "building this place, fighting the blizzards, the droughts, the wolves. I thought it was the land I was fighting, but it was fear of losing it all. It made me hard. It made me afraid to trust anything but my own fist. A home is not just the land." "Father," Daniel said, his voice soft but firm, "it is the people who stand on it, the ones you stand with. That is what I was afraid of losing tonight." A profound, unspoken understanding passed between them, a bridge built across years of stubborn pride and silent disagreement. The hard lines on Elias's face seemed to soften in the firelight. He looked over at Eliza, then at the unconscious man on his table, a man he had pulled from a snowdrift months ago. The complicated, tangled debts of life and death had all come due tonight. Eliza rose and walked over to her father. She gently brushed a stray lock of wet hair from his forehead. His face, in repose, looked younger. The years of whiskey and regret momentarily smoothed away. He had failed her in 1,000 ways, but in the one moment that mattered most, he had not. He had stood in front of the bullet. She reached into the pocket of her slicker and pulled out the pieces of her mother's gourd. It was shattered, but she had gathered every fragment. She held a curved piece in her palm, its surface worn smooth by time. Silas's eyelids fluttered open. His gaze was hazy, unfocused, until it landed on her face. His lips moved, forming a single, broken word: "Sorry." Tears she had refused to shed in public, in front of the gossips and the gunslingers, now welled in her eyes and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheeks. She held up the piece of the broken flask. "Even a cracked gourd can hold a little kindness," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed grief. "If you hold it carefully." He seemed to understand. A flicker of peace passed over his features before his eyes drifted shut again. A knock at the door startled them all. Daniel opened it to find Reverend Pike and Sheriff May O'Rourke standing on the porch, their faces etched with concern. The Reverend was holding a cloth-covered basket. "We heard," he said, his voice still a bit shaky. "The Women's Auxiliary, they sent cornbread." He looked at Silas, his expression a mixture of pity and a lingering shame from his own part in the day's earlier legal drama. Sheriff O'Rourke stepped inside, shaking the rain from her hat. She was all business. She took in the scene at a glance: the bandaged man, the rifle against the wall, the quiet tension in the room. Her gaze softened slightly when it rested on Eliza. She walked over to the basket the Reverend had placed on a side table and lifted a corner of the cloth. "Looks a little dry," she observed, her voice as crisp and unsentimental as ever. She looked around at the solemn faces in the room. "Still," she added with a wry twitch of her lips, "most anything is good if you drown it in enough honey." For a moment, there was silence. Then Daniel let out a short, surprised bark of laughter. Elias grunted, a sound that was almost a chuckle. And then, Eliza, to her own astonishment, found herself smiling through her tears. The sheriff's dry, practical humor was a dose of sanity, a reminder that the world, even after a night of blood and terror, still contained small, ordinary things like dry cornbread and honey. The laughter, quiet and fragile as it was, broke the spell of grief and fear. It was the first breath of air after being too long underwater. Later, after the sheriff had taken their official statements and the Reverend had offered a prayer that was, for once, simple and direct, the visitors departed. Silas was moved to a cot by the fire, his breathing deep and even. The rain had finally stopped, and a profound, clean-washed quiet settled over the ranch. Eliza stepped out onto the porch, into the cool, damp air. The clouds were breaking apart, and a million stars, sharp and brilliant as chips of ice, were scattered across the black velvet of the sky. The world smelled of wet earth and pine, a scent of renewal and life. Daniel followed her out, coming to stand beside her at the railing. They stood in a comfortable silence for a long time, watching the stars emerge. The shared ordeal had stripped away all pretense, leaving a raw, honest connection between them. "It is quieter now," Eliza said softly. "Yes," Daniel replied, his gaze on the distant, dark line of the hills. He hesitated, then said, almost to himself, "The whole ranch, it feels like it breathes easier when you are here." The words hung in the still night air, an unplanned, unadorned truth. He had not meant to say it, but now that it was said, he knew it was true. He turned to look at her, and in the faint starlight, he could see the surprise, and something else in her eyes. The space between them, which had been filled with conflict and duty and the harsh realities of their lives, was now filled with a different kind of tension, something quiet and warm and terrifyingly new. She did not speak. She did not have to. He moved closer, his movements slow, uncertain. He reached out and gently took her hand. Her fingers were cold, but they curled around his, a small, trusting gesture that made his heart ache. He drew her closer, and she went willingly, until she was standing in the circle of his arms. He held her for a long time, his chin resting on the top of her head. It was not a hug of passion, but of profound, bone-deep comfort. It was the feeling of two people who had been alone for a very long time suddenly finding a safe harbor. She leaned into him, her face against the rough wool of his coat, and for the first time since her mother had died, she felt like she was home. He tilted her chin up with his free hand. Her eyes were luminous in the starlight. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was a quiet, gentle kiss, as clean and honest as the rain-washed air. It tasted of salt from her tears, of the cold night, and of a future that had, until this very moment, seemed impossible. It was a kiss that asked for nothing and promised everything. The world faded away, leaving only the two of them on a dark porch, under a canopy of stars, at the quiet end of a long and violent day. The weeks that followed the night of the rain were like a long, slow sunrise. The land, slaked of its thirst, responded with a quiet, joyful explosion of green, new grass, tender and bright, pushed up through the red soil, and the trickle in the ditch Eliza had proposed became a steady, life-giving flow. The breeding herd, shaken but intact, settled into a peaceful rhythm, their calves growing strong in the suddenly lush pastures. The ranch, which had been holding its breath for a season, finally exhaled. Life found a new cadence, a harmony built from the violent chords of the past. Silas' heart, against all odds, began to heal. The bullet had missed anything vital, and under Eliza's constant, patient care, the color returned to his cheeks. He was quiet, a man hollowed out by his own failures, but the desperate, haunted look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, abiding sorrow and the first, fragile shoots of resolve. The greatest change, however, was seen in the South Corral. Every evening, Eliza would go to Juniper, the wild filly who had mirrored her own untamed spirit. She no longer spoke to the horse from outside the fence. She entered the corral, moving with a calm, unhurried grace, and simply stood, letting the filly grow accustomed to her presence. One evening, she brought a saddle blanket, laying it gently over the horse's back. Juniper trembled but did not bolt. The next night, she brought the saddle. It was a slow, patient conversation, conducted not with words, but with breath and stillness and a mutual understanding of a wildness that was not meant to be broken, but to be trusted. Finally, a week later, Eliza cinched the girth, swung a leg over, and sat in the saddle. The filly stood, her muscles quivering, then took a single, hesitant step, then another, She had accepted the rider. She had found a partner, not a master. Daniel watched from the porch, and he knew he was witnessing more than just the gentling of a horse. He was watching Eliza claim her place in this world, not by force, but by a quiet, persistent strength. The shift was felt inside the ranch house as well. One afternoon, Elias called Daniel into his office, a room that smelled of old leather and account books. The old man was not looking at the ledgers. He was staring out the window, at the greening hills. "That ditch," Elias said, "without turning around, it saved us. That, and her seeing the rustlers." He paused, the words of admission still new and awkward in his mouth. "Your way of seeing things. It is different than mine. I see the threat. You see the possibility. I have been running this ranch on fear for too long." He finally turned, his eyes meeting his son's. "It is time this ranch had a partner, not just an owner. I am sending word to the lawyer in the county seat. We are drawing up papers to make you a full co-owner. It is your future. Daniel, you should build it the way you see fit." It was the most profound concession Elias had ever made, an act of faith that meant more than any inheritance. Daniel was speechless for a moment, the weight of the trust settling on his shoulders not as a burden, but as a mantle. "Thank you, Father," he said, the two words carrying the weight of a lifetime. Eliza, too, was building her own future. As soon as Silas was strong enough to be left alone for a few hours, she rode Grits to her cabin. It stood just as she had left it, the small, sturdy structure, a silent testament to her mother's resilience. The rosebush by the door, nourished by the recent rains, had put forth a few new, tender green leaves. She spent the day there, airing it out, sweeping the floor, reclaiming her space. She was not leaving Black Mesa, but she was not abandoning this piece of herself, either. The following week, she nailed a new, neatly painted sign to the fence post by the road. It read, in simple, clear letters E, Heart, Saddle and Harness Repair, Livestock First Aid. She was still bound by her father's labor contract, but she would have something of her own. Her work in the evenings, her skill with a needle and her knowledge of animal care would earn her own money, a small but vital stream of independence. The ripples of that violent night on the basalt hills had spread to Cotton Draw, and the tide of public opinion had begun to turn. The whispers about the sold girl had been replaced by murmurs of respect for the woman who had faced down rustlers and saved the Caldwell herd. One afternoon, a wagon pulled up to the ranch house. It was a delegation from the church's women's auxiliary, led by a surprisingly contrite Mrs. Gable. They had not come to judge. They had come to ask a favor. "Miss Hart, Mrs." Gable said, her gaze for once direct and uncritical. "With the new railroad spur coming, there will be more people, more animals. We were wondering if you would be willing to teach a class for the women of the town on basic first aid for livestock, so we can all be a little more prepared." It was a peace offering, a formal invitation back into the community she had been cast out of. Eliza looked at the faces of the women, and she saw not malice, but a genuine, practical need. "I would be happy to," she said simply. Even Reverend Pike's sermons, Daniel reported with a wry smile, had taken on a new theme of justice, mercy, and the courage to speak truth, delivered with far less stammering than usual. Daniel found himself practicing. He would stand out by the river, skipping stones across the water, muttering phrases under his breath. He tried out words he had read in books. Poetic, flowery declarations that sounded utterly ridiculous when said aloud in his own plain, honest voice. He tried to speak of her eyes being like the prairie sky, but then worried about whether he meant before or after a dust storm. He tried to talk of her spirit being like a wild river, but the only river nearby was now a placid, well-behaved stream. One evening, Eliza came upon him by the corral, looking so deeply lost in thought that he did not hear her approach. He was holding a small, smooth stone in his hand, turning it over and over. "A thing of beauty is a joy for all time," he muttered to the stone, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Forever," Eliza corrected gently. "A joy forever." He jumped, startled, the stone clattering to the ground. A dark flush rose up his neck. "I was just thinking—" She smiled, a warm, knowing smile that reached her eyes. "It sounded like you were trying to sweet-talk a rock." She came closer, her expression full of a fond, gentle humor. "Daniel, what are you trying to do?" He let out a frustrated sigh. "I am trying to find the right words," he admitted, his gaze dropping to the toes of his boots. "And they all feel like they belong to someone else." She reached out and laid a hand on his arm. "Then use your own words," she said softly. "Just talk to me. You do not need to be a poet. Just talk to me the way you would talk to a frightened calf you are trying to gentle, honest, and quiet." He looked at her, at the complete lack of artifice in her face, and felt the foolishness of his efforts melt away. She was right. Their relationship was not built on poetry. It was built on shared work, on silent understanding, on standing together in a storm. A few days later, in the late afternoon, he asked her to walk with him. He led her to a high meadow overlooking the ranch, a place where the new grass was thick and soft underfoot. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the clouds in shades of rose and gold. They stood for a moment in silence. The whole of Black Mesa spread out below them, peaceful and alive. He took her hand. It felt small and strong in his— "Eliza," he began, his voice a little rough, but it was his own. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple ring of silver. It was not perfectly round, and it bore the faint marks of a hammer, but it shone with a soft, warm luster in the evening light. "My mother," he said, his voice quiet. "She had a set of silver spoons she brought with her from the East. They were the only truly fine things she owned. After she passed, my father put them away. I took one of them. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. It is not much, it is not fancy, but it is a piece of my past, and I was hoping it might be a part of our future." He looked into her eyes, and all the practiced, foolish words were forgotten, replaced by a simple, profound truth. "I cannot promise you a life without storms. Eliza, this land is too hard for that, but I can promise to stand with you in them. I can promise to build with you and to protect what we build. I promise to be your partner in all of it." Tears welled in Eliza's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. She looked at the ring on her finger, a circle of memory and promise. She looked at his honest, open face, and she saw her future. "A home," she said, her voice thick with emotion but as steady as the earth beneath their feet, "is a place we build together, not a place that is sold." She raised her free hand to his face, her touch gentle. "Yes, Daniel, yes." He pulled her into his arms, a hug full of relief and a joy so deep it was almost painful. And as they stood locked in an embrace in the golden light of the setting sun, from the pasture below, a clear, ringing sound carried on the evening air. It was Juniper, the wild filly, lifting her head from the sweet grass and letting out a long, happy whinny, as if in witness and approval. They were not married in the drafty church with its hollow-sounding bell, but in the heart of the ranch house, in the big kitchen that had become a place of healing and confession, the great stone hearth, roaring with a cheerful, steady fire, was their altar. There was no fine dress, no cascade of flowers. Eliza wore a simple blue calico dress, the one she had sewn herself, and in her hair she had tucked a single, brave green leaf from her mother's recovering rosebush. Daniel wore a clean shirt and a look of such profound, quiet joy that it seemed to light the room more than the fire itself. Their congregation was small and true. Sheriff May O'Rourke stood as a witness, her shotgun exchanged for a small, clumsily wrapped parcel. Reverend Pike, his voice clear and steady for the first time in recent memory, stood beside her, his Bible held in hands that did not tremble. Elias was there, his posture still stiff, but the hard, cold light in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, watchful pride. The ranch hands, scrubbed clean and smelling faintly of soap and leather, stood awkwardly along the back wall, their hats clutched in their hands. A few neighbors had come, too, bringing not fancy gifts, but offerings from the heart: a jar of wild honey, a freshly baked loaf of bread, a lucky knot of plaited rope to hang over their door for a strong union. As Reverend Pike began the simple service, one of the older women from a neighboring homestead, a woman whose memory was longer than her charity, leaned over to her husband. She whispered, the words carrying just far enough to be overheard in a momentary lull. Still, you have to admit, it is a strange thing. Her father sold her to a rancher owner. The old poison, diluted but not yet gone. Daniel, standing beside Eliza, heard the words. He did not flinch. He did not scowl. A slow, gentle smile touched his lips, and he turned his head slightly to look at Eliza, his eyes full of a love that was fierce and protective and utterly confident. They can say that if they like, he murmured, his voice a low, private vow meant only for her. But what I know is that today, the man of this ranch was chosen by her to stand beside for the rest of his life. He had taken their ugliest rumor and reforged it into a declaration of her power, her choice, in his eyes. She was not a victim who had been saved. She was a partner who had chosen her own destiny. That, she knew, was the foundation of the home they would build. The world outside the ranch was also finding a new, more just equilibrium. The wheels of county justice, though they turned slowly, ground exceedingly fine. Tate Mallory and his men were tried and convicted. The testimony of the Caldwells, Eliza, and even a shamefaced Reverend Pike, combined with the hard evidence of the kerosene can and the stolen cattle, was irrefutable. Mallory was sentenced to a long term in the territorial prison for attempted arson, cattle rustling, and extortion. His gang, deprived of its cruel, cunning leader, dissolved like mist in the morning sun. The news of the railroad spur proved true, and as the survey crews moved closer, a current of optimism and new money began to flow into Cotton Draw, washing away some of the desperation that had allowed men like Mallory to thrive. Silas Hart lived. He moved back to the small cabin, his body healed, his spirit engaged in a slower, more difficult convalescence. The whiskey was gone, replaced by an endless procession of buckets of water for the garden he had started. He worked the soil with a quiet, dogged determination, as if trying to cultivate in the earth the steadfastness he had never found in himself. He planted squash and beans and corn, and when Eliza and Daniel visited him one afternoon, they found him leaning on his hoe, looking at the neat green rows with a look of weary satisfaction. "It is good to see you looking so well, Father," Eliza said, her heart full of a complex, forgiving love. Silas wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of a dirt-stained hand. A small, wry smile, a ghost of his old humor, touched his lips. "It is a sight easier," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp, "to grow squash than it is to raise a person right." It was the closest he would ever come to a full apology, and it was enough. Eliza took the shattered pieces of her mother's gourd back to the ranch. She did not try to glue them back together. The breaks were part of its story now, part of her story. Instead, she drilled a small hole in each fragment and, using waxed thread, tied them together, creating a rustic wind chime. She hung it from a hook on the porch of the main house. When the wind blew in from the high meadows, the pieces would knock gently against each other, producing a soft, hollow, musical sound. It was the sound of something that had been broken but was not silenced, a melody made from memory and resilience. The land itself seemed to have turned a page. The season of young grass arrived, a vibrant, hopeful green that carpeted the hills. The calves, fat and frisky, chased each other in playful circles. The ditch, their lifeline, sparkled in the sun, no longer a desperate measure but a permanent feature of a thriving landscape. Even the basalt hills, the site of the violent climax, seemed to have softened. The rain on the basalt was no longer a symbol of a brutal washing away, but of the gentle morning dew that now collected on the dark rocks, glittering like diamonds in the dawn. Eliza did not become Mrs. Caldwell in the way the world expected. Her sign remained at the end of the lane, E. Hart, Saddle and Harness Repair, Livestock First Aid. A few feet away, a new, larger sign was erected, its letters bold and confident: Caldwell and Son Cattle Company. The two signs stood side by side, two separate, strong identities, a partnership of equals. One afternoon, Sheriff O'Rourke stopped by on her rounds, accepting a cup of coffee on the porch. She looked at the two signs, then at Eliza, who was stitching a tear in a bridle with practiced ease. "You know," the sheriff said, her tone thoughtful, "the world is full of men like Mallory, always looking to find a person's price, to buy them cheap and sell them for a profit." She took a sip of her coffee. "But I have learned something watching you. When someone has been sold cheap, the only way to buy them back is with kindness and right action. It is the only currency that holds its value." That night, a deep, peaceful quiet lay over the valley. The stars were a brilliant spill of light across the immense, dark sky. Eliza and Daniel sat together on the porch swing, a comfortable silence between them. Daniel had brought out 2 pieces of cornbread, leftovers from the offering the church ladies had brought on their peace mission. The edges were a little burnt. He handed a piece to her, and she took a bite. It was dry, just as the sheriff had predicted. A slow smile spread across her face. She leaned her head on his shoulder, the silver ring on her finger cool against his skin. "You know," she said, her voice full of laughter, "it really is better if you drown it in a lot of honey." His laughter joined hers, a warm, honest sound that rolled out into the vast, quiet darkness of the West. It was the sound of a home, not one that had been inherited or bought, but one that had been built, piece by piece, through courage and labor and a stubborn, enduring compassion. It was the sound of a future, bright and open and full of promise, rising from the red dust of Black Mesa. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We would love to connect with our community, so please leave a comment below telling us where in the world you are listening from. Subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.